It was another busy Friday night at the Golden Oak, one of Manhattan's trendiest bars. The place was packed, filled with a mix of corporate types winding down after a long work week and young professionals looking to kickstart their weekend. The warm, ambient lighting bathed the wooden interiors in a golden glow, while smooth jazz floated from the speakers, adding to the sophisticated atmosphere. Behind the bar, Peter was in his element. He was the head bartender and prided himself on running a tight ship. Known for his quick wit and charm, he kept the regulars coming back. But Peter also had a less flattering reputation. He was notorious for ignoring customers who, in his eyes, didn't quite fit in with the upscale crowd he preferred to serve. Peter moved swiftly behind the counter, pouring drinks with flair, joking with familiar faces, and making sure every glass was filled promptly. The regulars loved him, and he loved their generous tips. But Peter's friendly demeanor faded the moment someone outside his usual clientele approached the bar. That's when Jamal Johnson walked in. He was in his late 20s, dressed sharply in a well-fitted navy suit that hinted at a professional background. With his confident stride, he didn't look out of place in the bustling bar. Yet, as he approached the counter, it quickly became clear that Peter didn't see it that way. Jamal stood at the bar, waiting patiently to catch Peter's attention. The bartender glanced in his direction, but swiftly turned away, choosing instead to serve another customer who had just walked up. Jamal noticed but didn't react. Instead, he kept his calm, observing Peter as he flitted back and forth, serving drinks and chatting animatedly with other patrons. "Hey, can I get a whiskey on the rocks?" Jamal finally called out after waiting for a few more minutes. Peter shot him a quick, dismissive glance but ignored the request, turning to pour a cocktail for a couple who had just arrived. Jamal's eyes narrowed slightly, but he stayed where he was, leaning casually against the counter. Minutes passed, and several customers who came after Jamal were served promptly. Peter acted as if Jamal wasn't even there, treating him like he was invisible. A few patrons around the bar started to notice, exchanging puzzled looks, but no one said anything. The unspoken tension in the air was palpable. Jamal, however, remained unflustered. He'd been in situations like this before. He knew the game that was being played, and he wasn't about to let Peter's rudeness get under his skin. He just watched, waiting to see how far Peter would take it. Peter, meanwhile, was getting more annoyed by the second. He didn't like Jamal's calm demeanor. It was as if the man was silently challenging him. In his mind, this was his domain, and he wasn't going to let some random guy disrupt the smooth flow of his bar. "What's your problem, man? Can't you see I'm busy?" Peter snapped finally, leaning in close enough for only Jamal to hear. "Why don't you try somewhere else? This place is packed." Jamal raised an eyebrow but didn't let the hostility faze him. He simply smiled, a calm, knowing look in his eyes. "I'm in no rush," Jamal replied coolly. "I'll wait," Peter huffed, shaking his head in disbelief before turning away once more. But this time, a few customers near the bar had heard the exchange and were starting to murmur among themselves. It was clear to some that Jamal was being treated unfairly, but the patrons didn't want to get involved. After all, Peter was the one with their drinks. As the minutes ticked by, Jamal remained patient. He leaned back, scanning the bar, observing the interactions between the staff and customers. It wasn't just Peter. Jamal noticed a pattern in how the staff treated certain customers differently, especially those who didn't fit the usual profile. Finally, Peter's irritation boiled over. "Look, if you're not ordering anything, get out of the way," he barked, waving Jamal off dismissively. The bar was getting busier, and he didn't want to waste time on someone he'd already decided wasn't worth it. Jamal didn't move an inch. Instead, he let out a soft chuckle and shook his head. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" he said quietly, just loud enough for Peter to hear over the noise of the bar. Peter gave him a confused look, but before he could respond, the bar's manager, Thomas, walked up, noticing the tension. "Is everything all right here?" Thomas asked, glancing between Jamal and Peter. Jamal offered a polite smile. "Everything's fine," he said smoothly. "I was just having a bit of trouble getting a drink." Thomas looked over at Peter, who seemed caught off guard. "Peter, did you not see him waiting?" Thomas asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. Peter just shrugged, unwilling to admit fault. "It's busy. I can't serve everyone at once," he muttered defensively. Thomas didn't look convinced, but Jamal simply nodded, still wearing that calm smile. "No worries," he said, locking eyes with Peter for a moment before turning back to Thomas. "I'll just wait." As Thomas walked away, Peter shot Jamal a look of pure annoyance. Jamal, however, was unfazed. He knew this night was far from over, and Peter was about to learn that treating people poorly based on appearances can have serious consequences. After that tense exchange, Jamal decided to shift his focus back to enjoying his evening. He didn't want to let Peter's rude behavior ruin his night, especially not when he had other plans in mind. With a calm, composed demeanor, he found a small table near the back of the bar. From there, he could quietly observe everything without being in the way. Peter, meanwhile, tried to shake off the irritation Jamal had caused him. The bar was bustling, and he needed to stay focused. As he mixed drinks and took orders, he couldn't help but cast occasional glances toward where Jamal was sitting, as if to ensure he wouldn't cause more trouble. The bar continued to fill up as the night went on. The sound of laughter, clinking glasses, and upbeat music made it difficult for anyone to notice the brewing tension between the bartender and the lone customer at the back. But Jamal, with his sharp eyes, took in every detail. He observed Peter's selective behavior as he prioritized certain customers over others. It was subtle, but to someone paying close attention, it was clear. A couple of hours passed, and the energy in the bar reached its peak. Jamal remained patient, sitting quietly, watching as Peter expertly navigated through the crowd. But instead of leaving, Jamal decided to stay. He had a reason for being here tonight, and he wasn't about to walk away before completing what he had planned. Eventually, Thomas, the manager, noticed Jamal still sitting there, now without a drink. With a look of concern, he approached Jamal's table. "Hey, I noticed you're still waiting," Thomas said, his voice friendly but with a hint of apology. "Is everything all right? Can I get you something myself?" Jamal smiled up at Thomas, appreciating the gesture. "I'd appreciate that, thank you," he said. "Just a whiskey on the rocks." Thomas nodded and headed back to the bar, giving Peter a pointed look as he passed by. Peter shot him a glare, but said nothing. He was already feeling the pressure of the busy night, and the last thing he needed was his manager getting on his case over a customer he had no interest in serving. As Thomas prepared to drink himself, Peter couldn't resist muttering under his breath, "Why are you wasting time on that guy? He's just loitering." Thomas paused and turned to face Peter, narrowing his eyes. "Every customer here deserves the same respect. he said firmly. "You might want to remember that." Peter rolled his eyes but kept his mouth shut. He had worked here long enough to know when to bite his tongue. Still, he couldn't help but feel annoyed at how much attention this one guy was getting. Thomas brought the drink over to Jamal's table with an apologetic smile. "Sorry about the wait," he said, placing the glass down. "It's on the house." Jamal took the glass with a nod of gratitude. "Thank you. I appreciate it," he replied. He took a slow sip, savoring the taste, while keeping his eyes on the bar. It was almost time to set his plan into motion. Meanwhile, back at the bar, Peter noticed a group of men entering. They were regulars, successful businessmen who frequented the Golden Oak. Immediately, Peter perked up, ready to give them his full attention. These were the kind of customers he loved serving. Big tippers, the ones who made his shifts worth the effort. "Hey, Peter," one of the men called out as they approached the bar. "Get us the usual, will you?" "Coming right up," Peter replied with enthusiasm. He quickly started preparing their favorite cocktails, flashing his best smile. This was the type of service he was known for, smooth, efficient, and charming. For a moment, he almost forgot about the annoyance sitting in the back corner. But Jamal hadn't forgotten. He watched the entire scene unfold, noting how Peter's demeanor changed when faced with customers he deemed worthy. It was almost amusing to watch, like a performance. But Jamal wasn't here to simply observe. He was here to make a statement, one that Peter wouldn't soon forget. As the night wore on, the bar began to thin out. The crowd was slowly dwindling, and it was clear that closing time was approaching. Jamal finally decided it was time to make his move. He stood up, adjusting his suit, and walked back to the bar. Peter saw him approaching, but chose to ignore him, hoping the man would just leave quietly now that it was almost closing time. But Jamal wasn't going anywhere. "Excuse me," Jamal said, his voice steady and polite. "I'd like to settle my tab." Peter turned around, feigning surprise. "Oh, are you actually buying something this time?" he asked with a sarcastic tone. Jamal just smiled. "Actually, I've already had my drink. Your manager took care of it for me," he replied, his eyes gleaming with something that Peter couldn't quite place. "But I do have some business here that I think you'll want to hear about." Peter raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. "Oh, yeah? And what kind of business could you possibly have here?" Jamal leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I think it's time we talk about who I really am." Before Peter could respond, the door to the bar swung open, and an older man with a confident stride walked in. His presence was commanding, and several of the remaining patrons turned to see who had just entered. It was clear that this man was someone important. Peter's face went pale as he recognized the newcomer, Mr. Johnson, the owner of the Golden Oak himself. The usually stern businessman had a rare, warm smile on his face as he walked straight over to Jamal. "Son, I've been looking for you," Mr. Johnson said with a broad grin, pulling Jamal into a hug. Peter's jaw dropped. He stood frozen, unable to process what he was witnessing. Jamal, the man he had ignored all night, was the son of the very owner who signed his paychecks. The revelation hung in the air like a thunderclap. The few patrons left in the bar stared in stunned silence, and Peter's heart sank as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. Jamal, now released from his father's embrace, turned back to Peter with that same calm smile. "Well, Peter," Jamal said softly, "I guess it's time to settle the score." The entire bar seemed to freeze in time as the reality of Jamal's connection to the owner sank in. Peter's heart pounded, his mind racing to process the shocking turn of events. He had just spent the entire evening treating the son of the bar's owner with nothing but disdain and disrespect. Now, the consequences of his actions loomed ominously over him. Jamal, meanwhile, kept his composure, his calm demeanor hiding the satisfaction of revealing the truth. He knew that patience had its rewards, and tonight he was about to reap them. Mr. Johnson, still beaming, turned to the few remaining patrons who were watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. "I'm sorry to interrupt your evening, folks," he said jovially, "but I couldn't be prouder to introduce my son, Jamal." A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. Peter felt a wave of nausea. This was no ordinary customer he had mistreated. This was family. Jamal's polite smile remained fixed, but there was an unmistakable intensity in his eyes as he looked directly at Peter. "Thank you, Dad," Jamal said, his voice calm but firm. "Actually, I was hoping we could have a word about some things I observed tonight." Peter's stomach tightened. He knew exactly what this was about. Thomas, the manager, who had been wiping down the bar, straightened up, sensing trouble. He quickly made his way over, positioning himself between Jamal and Peter as if trying to defuse whatever bomb was about to go off. "Is there a problem, Jamal?" Thomas asked carefully, casting a wary glance at Peter, who was sweating bullets. Jamal tilted his head slightly, his eyes never leaving Peter. "Not a problem," he said slowly. "More like an opportunity to address a certain attitude issue that I encountered tonight." Peter's face turned a deep shade of red. He was caught. There was no denying it. No talking his way out of it now that the owner himself was standing right there, looking at him expectantly. "Peter," Mr. Johnson said, his tone now more serious, "is there something you need to explain?" Peter's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. He knew that no excuse would justify the way he had treated Jamal earlier. So, instead, he hung his head, avoiding eye contact. "Dad, it's all right," Jamal said, stepping in before Peter could dig himself into a deeper hole. "I think it's more important to focus on how we can make this place better for everyone." Jamal's words were smooth, but there was a subtle edge to them that wasn't lost on Peter. It was a second chance, one that Jamal didn't have to give, but was extending nonetheless. Mr. Johnson, sensing his son's wisdom, nodded approvingly. "Jamal's right," Mr. Johnson said firmly. "We built this place on the foundation of respect and inclusion. If anyone working here doesn't understand that, then we got a serious issue." His eyes flashed toward Peter, who felt himself shrink under the intense gaze. Before Peter could respond, Jamal took a step closer. "I believe everyone deserves the benefit of the doubt," he said, loud enough for the other staff members and remaining patrons to hear. "But respect isn't optional. It's a requirement. Tonight was an enlightening experience." Thomas quickly jumped in, sensing an opportunity to steer the conversation toward a more positive outcome. "I agree, Jamal. We've always prided ourselves on treating our guests like family, and clearly, we need to reinforce that value." Peter stood there, silent, his face burning with shame. It was clear to him now that he had not only risked his job, but also his reputation. The weight of his actions pressed heavily on his shoulders. He swallowed hard, trying to find the courage to speak. I apologize, Jamal. Peter finally managed to stammer, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was wrong. I shouldn't have treated you or anyone else that way." Jamal studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow nod, he replied, "Apology accepted. But understand, Peter, words alone don't change much. Actions do." Peter nodded vigorously, relief flooding through him, though he knew he was far from being off the hook. This was just the beginning of making amends. Mr. Johnson, who had been observing silently, stepped forward and clapped a hand on Peter's shoulder. "Let this be a lesson to all of us," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "This business only works if we treat every single person who walks through those doors with the dignity they deserve." The bar, which had been gradually emptying as the confrontation played out, was now nearly deserted except for a few curious onlookers who lingered to see how it would all end. The tension in the air slowly dissipated as Jamal, his father, and the staff came to a mutual understanding. Thomas took the initiative to send the remaining customers off with complimentary drinks to smooth over the evening's drama. As he turned back toward Jamal and Mr. Johnson, he offered, "Maybe we could all sit down together and discuss how to improve things moving forward." Jamal nodded appreciatively. "I think that's a great idea. But first, I want to talk to Peter alone." A hush fell over the room as the staff members exchanged uneasy glances. Peter's heart began to pound again. The conversation wasn't over yet. Jamal wasn't done with him, not by a long shot. "Let's take this to the back," Jamal said, gesturing toward a hallway that led to the storage room. Peter hesitated, then followed Jamal, his mind racing with thoughts of what might happen next. As they walked into the dimly lit back room, away from the eyes and ears of everyone else, Peter braced himself for whatever was to come. Jamal closed the door behind them, leaving the muffled sounds of the bar behind. "All right, Peter," Jamal said, turning to face him. "Now that it's just the two of us, let's have an honest conversation about what went down tonight." Peter's heart pounded in his chest as the door to the back room clicked shut behind him. The dim light cast a shadowy hue over the room, creating an atmosphere thick with tension. Jamal leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his eyes locked on Peter. It was just the two of them now, no audience, no distractions. For the first time that evening, Peter felt truly exposed. Jamal took a deep breath, letting the silence linger before speaking. "All right, Peter," he began, his voice calm but resolute. "I think it's time we have a real conversation. No more hiding behind the bar or pretending you didn't know better." Peter swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had never been in a situation like this before. Jamal was younger, yet the authority in his voice was undeniable. The fact that Jamal had kept his composure all night only added to Peter's growing sense of guilt. I know I messed up," Peter stammered, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I didn't realize who you were." Jamal's expression remained unmoved. "Let me be clear," he said, stepping closer, his tone growing firmer. "It's not about who I am. It's about how you treat people, period. If I had been just another customer, would that have justified how you acted? Would it have been okay to talk to me like that?" Peter was caught off guard by the question. He opened his mouth to respond, but realized there was no good answer. He dropped his gaze to the floor, his shoulders slumping. "No," he admitted. "It wouldn't have been okay." Jamal nodded, appreciating the small hint of honesty. "I've seen too many people like you," he continued. People who think they can pick and choose who deserves respect based on appearances. But that's not how it works, Peter. Not here. Not anywhere. Peter felt a lump forming in his throat. He had always prided himself on being professional, on doing his job efficiently. But now, faced with the reality of his actions, he realized just how far he had strayed from the values he thought he upheld. He looked up at Jamal, eyes glistening with a mix of regret and desperation. I'm truly sorry, Jamal, he said, his voice cracking. I don't know what came over me. It's not who I am. Jamal studied him for a moment, weighing the sincerity in Peter's words. You say that's not who you are, Jamal said slowly, but tonight, that's exactly who you showed yourself to be. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Peter was taken aback. He had expected anger, maybe even an ultimatum. But instead, Jamal was challenging him to take responsibility, to change. For a moment, Peter was at a loss for words. But then, he felt something shift inside him, a flicker of determination to set things right. I want to fix this, Peter said earnestly. I don't want to be that person. Tell me what I can do to make it right. Jamal nodded slowly, seeming to consider his words. First, he began, you can start by treating every customer who walks through those doors with the respect they deserve. No exceptions. Second, I think you owe my father an apology. He built this place to be welcoming to everyone. And what you did tonight went against everything he stands for. Peter nodded vigorously. Yes, of course. I'll apologize to him. And to you too. Properly this time. Jamal's gaze softened slightly, though his demeanor remained serious. Look, Peter, he said, I'm not here to ruin your life or get you fired. But if you want to stay here, you need to prove that you're willing to change. This isn't just about making amends with me or my dad. It's about being better every single day. Peter nodded, his eyes shining with a newfound resolve. I understand, he said. I'll do whatever it takes. Jamal took a step back, finally letting the tension in the room ease. Good. Then show me, he said simply. Actions speak louder than words. With that, Jamal turned and opened the door, stepping back into the main bar area where a few lingering patrons were finishing their drinks. Peter followed, feeling a strange mix of relief and anxiety. The conversation they had just shared was only the beginning. Now came the hard part of living up to his words. As they re-entered the bar, Mr. Johnson was waiting, his expression unreadable. The staff glanced nervously at Peter, clearly aware that something significant had just happened behind that closed door. Peter hesitated, but Jamal gave him an encouraging nod. It was now or never. Peter took a deep breath and walked up to Mr. Johnson. Sir, he began, his voice steadying as he went on, I want to apologize for everything. I've let you down, and I've let myself down. I'm committed to doing better, to being better. Mr. Johnson studied Peter for a long moment, then sighed. I appreciate the apology, Peter, but like my son said, it's actions that matter now. If you're truly willing to change, you'll have the opportunity to prove it. Peter nodded gratefully. Thank you, sir. I won't let you down. Jamal watched the exchange with a hint of a smile. Perhaps there was hope for Peter after all, but he knew better than to let his guard down completely. Change took time, and tonight was just the beginning of a long road ahead. As the bar began to wind down for the night, Thomas approached Jamal. I have to say, he remarked. "You handled that better than I ever could have. You've got a knack for this." Jamal chuckled. "Well, I've had years of practice dealing with people who underestimate me," he replied. "Let's just hope Peter's one of the few who actually learns from it." Thomas nodded, patting Jamal on the back. "If anyone can turn this place around, it's you," he said warmly. "Your dad's lucky to have you here." Jamal smiled, but behind that smile was a lingering question. Would Peter truly change, or was this just another empty promise? Only time would tell. For now, though, he was willing to give him the chance to prove himself. The next few days were tense at the bar. Peter had promised a change, but Jamal couldn't help but feel skeptical. He had heard all the excuses before. People claiming they would do better, only to slip back into old habits once the pressure was off. The real test was in the actions, not the words. Peter showed up to work the next evening, his face a little more serious than usual and a quiet resolve in his eyes. Jamal kept an eye on him from behind the bar, not expecting miracles, but hoping for something, anything, to show that Peter was willing to change. At first, Peter's efforts were subtle. He made sure to greet every customer with a smile, to remember their names, and even went out of his way to engage in friendly conversation. Jamal noticed that he was paying attention to the little things that mattered. But was it enough? Jamal wasn't sure. It was clear Peter was trying, but Jamal couldn't ignore the doubts in his mind. As the night wore on, more people filed into the bar, and Peter found himself handling a rush of orders. The tension that had been hovering over him seemed to dissipate as he fell into a rhythm. He was starting to look comfortable again, but Jamal wasn't convinced yet. "Hey, Peter, can I get a beer over here?" A man at the far end of the bar called out. Peter smiled and nodded, quickly getting to work. He grabbed the beer from the cooler, popped the cap, and placed it in front of the customer. "Here you go," Peter said with a smile. The man nodded, satisfied with the service, but Jamal saw something, a flash of hesitation in Peter's eyes when the man turned away. It was subtle, but it was there. Later, as Jamal was wiping down the counter, he noticed a group of customers sitting at one of the tables, laughing and chatting loudly. One of them, a man in a baseball cap, made a comment that caught Jamal's attention. "Hey, don't you think it's weird that the guy behind the bar has been acting like a saint all of a sudden? What's he trying to pull?" The group laughed, and Peter didn't hear the comment, but Jamal did. It wasn't the first time Peter had been the subject of gossip, but something about the tone of the remark bothered Jamal. He couldn't place it, but it felt dismissive, like Peter's efforts weren't being taken seriously. He couldn't ignore the fact that, despite Peter's attempts at being better, the customers still saw him as the same person who had messed up just a few days ago. Jamal took a deep breath. It wasn't enough for Peter to be better on the surface. He needed to prove that he was truly committed to changing the way he saw people, to change his mindset, because if he didn't, everything would fall apart again. As the night went on, Jamal kept his distance but watched carefully. Peter was making progress, but the challenges weren't over yet. Just before closing, Peter walked over to Jamal, looking a little nervous. "Hey, Jamal, can I talk to you for a minute?" Jamal looked up from cleaning the last glass. "Of course. What's up?" Peter hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "I just wanted to say, I know I still have a lot to prove, but I appreciate you giving me a chance. I don't want to let you down." Jamal studied him for a moment, The sincerity was there, but he wasn't about to let his guard down completely yet. "It's going to take more than words, Peter," he said. "It's going to take action." Peter nodded, his face a little flushed. "I know, and I'm ready to show you." Jamal didn't respond right away. He simply gave a small nod, acknowledging Peter's effort, but in the back of his mind, he wondered if it would last. People could change, but they had to want it more than anything. And Peter needed to prove he was willing to put in the work. Not just for Jamal, not just for his father, but for himself. That night, as Peter cleaned the bar and helped close up, Jamal lingered in the back, lost in thought. It had been a long day, and he was exhausted, but there was something about Peter's attitude that made him wonder if maybe, just maybe, he could get past the first hurdle. He had seen people change before, but rarely so quickly. If Peter kept going down this path, Jamal would have to reconsider his earlier skepticism. Maybe he was wrong about him, but he wasn't going to get ahead of himself. The night ended, and the bar emptied out, leaving behind the faint scent of whiskey and the clink of glasses. Peter was standing by the door when Jamal walked over. "Hey, I'll see you tomorrow, right?" Peter asked, a small, hopeful smile on his face. Jamal gave a short nod. "We'll see. Keep it up." Peter's smile widened, and for the first time since Jamal had met him, it didn't seem forced. It seemed genuine. As Jamal watched him leave, he felt a strange sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Peter was on the path to becoming the man he had the potential to be. But only time would tell. The following week brought a new set of challenges. Peter had been making progress, but Jamal knew that real change took time. He couldn't afford to let his guard down just yet. Despite Peter's outward efforts, Jamal remained cautious. He'd seen too many people try to change and fail, and he wasn't about to get his hopes up too soon. But there was something different about this time. Peter's determination was palpable, and Jamal couldn't deny that it made him think twice. That evening, as the bar filled with the usual mix of patrons, Jamal found himself behind the counter, observing Peter more intently than usual. Peter was handling things well, serving drinks, smiling, engaging with customers, but there was still a certain tension in the air. Jamal could sense it. The bar's regulars, especially the ones who'd witnessed Peter's past behavior, were watching closely. They were waiting for him to slip up, waiting for him to show his true colors. And if Peter was going to prove that he'd changed, this was a night to do it. A group of young men entered the bar, laughing and joking loudly. They were clearly looking for attention. Jamal didn't mind. The bar could use the energy, as long as they kept it respectful. But as they settled at the counter, it became clear that one of them, an older man with a thick beard, was in a bad mood. He kept eyeing Peter, sizing him up as if expecting trouble. Peter greeted them with a smile and took their drink orders, but the man with the beard was still watching him, scrutinizing every move. Jamal noticed it immediately. The man's gaze was heavy, almost threatening, and Peter seemed to feel it too. He tried to remain calm, but the tension was undeniable. As the man placed his order, Peter was a little slower than usual, fumbling slightly as he poured the drink. Jamal could see the nerves in his eyes, but he didn't say anything. This was a test, and Peter needed to figure out how to handle it himself. The man with the beard leaned in closer, lowering his voice just enough for Peter to hear. "What's with the attitude, huh? You got a problem with me, boy." Peter froze for a moment, clearly taken aback by the harshness in the man's tone. Jamal could feel the air thicken. He wasn't sure what Peter would do, but he was already mentally preparing himself for whatever came next. The bar had seen its fair share of confrontations, but this one felt different. Peter took a deep breath, the muscles in his jaw tightening. His hand shook slightly as he set the drink in front of the man. "No problem here, sir," he said, his voice steady, though Jamal could tell it wasn't easy for him to remain calm. The man scoffed. "Don't serve me. You're just some bartender, acting all high and mighty. What makes you think you can treat me like this?" Jamal watched closely, his heart racing. He knew Peter could lose his composure. He'd seen it before. But this time, Peter did something that surprised him. Instead of reacting with defensiveness or anger, Peter stood tall, met the man's eyes, and said, "I'm just here to do my job. If you don't like the way I'm doing it, you can leave." There was a brief silence. The man stared at Peter for a long moment, then muttered under his breath, "You've got a mouth on you. But whatever, I'll let it slide for now." Jamal could see Peter's shoulders relax ever so slightly. He'd passed the first test, but the night was far from over. Later, as the bar began to empty, Jamal found himself talking with Peter, making sure everything was in order before they closed. Peter seemed more at ease, though Jamal could tell he was still processing the confrontation with the man. "You handled that well tonight," Jamal said, his voice calm but firm. "But don't get too comfortable. Not everyone's going to let you off the hook that easily." Peter nodded, wiping down the counter. "Yeah, I know. I don't know what it is about that guy. He had it out for me from the moment he walked in." Jamal sighed, leaning against the bar. "That's the thing, Peter. Some people won't give you the benefit of the doubt. They'll hold on to their biases, and you have to decide how you're going to respond. It's not always going to be easy." Peter's face softened, and for the first time that night, he looked genuinely thoughtful. "I get it. I've been a jerk, and I'm sorry for that. I know it'll take more than just one night to prove myself, but I'm trying. I really am." Jamal studied him for a moment. He could see the sincerity in Peter's eyes, but he also knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. It was going to take consistent action, day after day, to rebuild the trust he had lost. But maybe, just maybe, Peter was finally ready to put in the work. "I know you are," Jamal replied. "Just remember, it's about more than just doing the right thing in the moment. It's about showing up every day and doing it consistently. I'm here to help you, but you've got to want it for yourself." Peter nodded, the weight of the conversation settling in. "I will. I promise." As they locked up for the night, Jamal couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Peter wasn't perfect, but he was trying, and sometimes that was all it took to make a difference. The following days were quieter, but there was a palpable shift in the air. Peter continued to work at the bar, showing up on time, being polite, and staying focused on his tasks. The customers who had once given him sideways glances were now starting to notice the change. Jamal saw it too, though he remained cautious. The real test wasn't how well Peter could perform in the short term, but whether this change would last when the pressure of old habits resurfaced. One evening, as the bar settled into its usual rhythm, a familiar face appeared at the door. It was Mr. Thomas, the businessman from the incident with the customers. Jamal hadn't seen him in weeks. He had assumed that their paths had simply diverged after the heated encounter with Peter. But here he was, strolling into the bar like nothing had happened. Peter was behind the counter, wiping down glasses when he noticed Mr. Thomas walk in. His expression shifted for a brief moment, and Jamal could see a flicker of tension cross his face. It was the same kind of look that Peter used to wear before he'd lash out. But this time, Peter didn't say a word. He greeted Mr. Thomas with the same professional smile he'd been wearing since his turnaround began. Jamal kept a close eye on the situation. He knew that while Peter had made progress, this was a potential trigger. If Peter reacted poorly, it could undo everything they'd worked toward. Mr. Thomas took a seat at the bar, and Peter served him without a hitch, his hand steady, his voice calm. Jamal was impressed by the lack of conflict, but as the conversation between Mr. Thomas and Peter unfolded, Jamal saw something even more telling. Peter wasn't just polite. He was composed. He was engaging with Mr. Thomas, listening carefully, offering thoughtful responses. The tension that had once seemed inescapable was gone. It was replaced by something that felt almost normal. As the evening wore on, Mr. Thomas lingered, having a couple more drinks, chatting with Peter like an old friend. Jamal couldn't help but notice the change in dynamics. Mr. Thomas, who had once been so dismissive and skeptical, was now genuinely treating Peter as an equal. There was no animosity, no patronizing comments, just a mutual respect. It wasn't until Mr. Thomas got up to leave that Jamal truly understood the weight of the transformation. As he passed Peter, he patted him on the back and said, "You're doing good, kid. Keep it up." Peter stood there for a moment after Mr. Thomas had left, staring at the door. He seemed lost in thought, and Jamal could see the gears turning in his mind. "I never thought he'd say something like that," Peter muttered under his breath, almost to himself. "I was sure he was going to make some snide remark, but he didn't." Jamal raised an eyebrow, leaning against the counter. "That's because you handled yourself well. He saw you differently tonight. He saw you as someone he could respect. That doesn't happen by accident." Peter nodded slowly. He was still processing everything, but Jamal could tell that the weight of those words had landed. "I guess I really am changing, huh?" Peter said, almost as if he were reassuring himself. "You are," Jamal replied, his voice steady. "But don't get complacent. This is just the beginning. You have to keep proving it, day by day." Peter smiled, a small, sincere grin. "I'm ready." Later that night, when the bar was closed and Jamal was locking up, he couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet pride. Peter had made it through a critical moment without falling back into his old ways. The path ahead wasn't going to be easy. Peter still had a long way to go, but Jamal had seen a real change, and for the first time, he was beginning to believe that Peter was truly committed to it. As Jamal stood outside the bar, looking up at the city skyline, he felt a quiet sense of hope. Change wasn't instantaneous, but it was possible. And sometimes, all it took was a single step in the right direction to start a journey that could change everything. The weeks that followed were a testament to Peter's resolve. He had truly embraced his transformation, and the atmosphere in the bar reflected it. The customers, once skeptical, had begun to see him not as a man of arrogance, but as someone who was genuinely working hard to improve. Jamal, though still watchful, couldn't help but feel a growing sense of pride. He had seen Peter grow into something entirely different from the person who had first walked through the door months ago. One evening, as the night crowd began to fill the bar, Peter was particularly focused, mixing drinks and chatting with patrons, his smile infectious. Jamal was in the back cleaning when he heard a voice call his name. "Jamal, you got a second?" It was Mr. Thomas, the businessman who had visited several times since their initial encounter. Jamal wiped his hands on a towel and walked over to the bar, where Mr. Thomas was waiting, nursing a scotch. "What's up?" Jamal asked, trying to sound casual, though he sensed there was something different about the way Mr. Thomas was standing. He wasn't smiling like usual. "I need to talk to you about something," Mr. Thomas said, his tone serious. "It's about Peter." Jamal raised an eyebrow. "Peter? What about him?" Mr. Thomas leaned forward, his voice dropping a notch. "I know you've been keeping an eye on him, and I think I owe you an apology for the way I treated him when he first started. But more than that, I've been thinking about something." Jamal stayed silent, giving Mr. Thomas space to explain himself. "You see," Mr. Thomas continued, his eyes flicking over to Peter, who was busy serving a group of customers, "I'm not just a businessman. I have a stake in this bar. My family owns a portion of it." Jamal's curiosity piqued, but he didn't interrupt. "Peter," Mr. Thomas went on, "he's not just some random guy working here. He's the son of the owner. His father's been involved in the business for years, but Peter, well, he's had his own struggles. I've known him since he was a kid." Jamal blinked, surprised by the revelation. Peter, the same Peter who had been disrespectful and distant, was the son of the owner? The weight of the information landed heavily on him, but he kept his composure. "So, you're telling me he's been working here all this time, and no one knew?" Jamal asked, still processing what Mr. Thomas had just shared. "That's right," Mr. Thomas said with a nod. "His father, the one who owns a good portion of the place, has been trying to keep him out of the spotlight. Peter's been going through a lot in his personal life, and I guess his dad wanted him to find his own way without relying on family connections. But things have changed. Peter wants to turn his life around, and I think he's finally making the effort." Jamal was speechless for a moment. He had never known Peter's backstory. All the tension, the struggles, the anger. He had never understood the root of it all. Mr. Thomas continued, "I've been hard on him, too. I was a part of the problem. But lately I've seen the effort. I've seen the change. And I wanted you to know that whatever happens here, I'll back him up. He deserves a shot." Jamal nodded slowly, trying to absorb it all. "I didn't know any of that. I just thought he was, well, difficult." "Most people did," Mr. Thomas agreed. "But that's the thing with Peter. He's never been given a fair chance. Not by people like me, not by anyone. But now, I think he's ready to prove himself." Jamal stood in silence for a moment before he spoke again. "I appreciate you telling me this. I've been hard on him too, in my own way. But I can see the change. It's not just the way he works. It's the way he carries himself now." Mr. Thomas gave a small smile, but there was a depth to it that Jamal hadn't seen before. "It's not always easy, is it? To see the potential in someone when you've only seen their flaws." Jamal chuckled softly. "No, it's not. But maybe that's the lesson." The conversation left Jamal with a lot to think about. As the night continued, he watched Peter interact with the customers, and for the first time, he saw him not just as a worker, but as someone who was genuinely trying to make a difference in his life. Peter's efforts were starting to pay off, and Jamal realized just how far he had come. Peter wasn't the same person he had been when he first walked into the bar. He wasn't the arrogant, disrespectful guy anymore. He was someone who had found the courage to confront his past and build something new, even without the privileges others might have had. As Jamal cleaned up after closing, he reflected on how much Peter had grown. The unspoken truth was that people weren't just defined by their past mistakes. They were capable of change. And Peter, in his own way, had shown that growth was possible, even for someone who had been overlooked for so long. Jamal smiled to himself, locking the door as he left for the night. He had come to respect Peter not just as a worker, but as someone who had earned a second chance. And for the first time in a long time, he truly believed that people could turn their lives around.